The question nobody asks. There's a question most people spend their entire lives running from. Not because they don't know it exists, but because the moment they stop moving long enough to hear it, they're terrified of the answer. The question isn't, what do I want? Or who do I love? Or even, what am I doing with my life? Those are the questions we let ourselves ask. Safe questions. Questions with expected answers. Questions we can dress up and perform for other people. The real question, the one that waits for you at 3 a.m. when the house is quiet and the phone is dark and there is absolutely nothing left to distract you, is this. Who are you when no one is watching? Not the version of you that shows up to work. Not the version that answers texts, nods in meetings, laughs at the right moments, posts the right things. The version that exists when the performance ends, when it's just you and silence. Most people never meet that person. And I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because for most of modern human existence, we have been engineered, slowly, systematically, and very successfully, to never be alone with ourselves long enough to find out. What you're about to hear is not a lecture about being more productive or disciplined or successful in the conventional sense. It's not a list of habits successful people have in common. This is something older than that. This is about a particular kind of freedom that has always existed, has always been available, and has been quietly threatened in every age by people who benefit from you never finding it. The Stoics knew about it, the Zen masters knew, the monks in the desert knew, the scientists who changed history knew, the artists who outlasted their era knew. And if you're still watching, somewhere inside you, you already know too. So, let's go find it. A society designed to keep you distracted. You didn't choose the era you were born into. And the era you were born into has one defining feature that no previous generation has had to navigate at this scale. The complete elimination of silence. Think about what happens the moment you wake up, before you've even fully opened your eyes, before your feet hit the floor, before you've had a single thought that belongs entirely to you. The phone is already in your hand. Notifications, news, messages, someone's opinion, someone's life, someone's face, someone's emergency that isn't actually an emergency. The day has already begun, and it didn't begin with you. This isn't about technology being evil. That's a naive argument. This is about understanding something far more precise. The architecture of modern distraction was not designed for your benefit. Every app that hooks your attention, every platform that rewards you for performing your life publicly, every algorithm that learns exactly which emotional button to push to keep you scrolling just 30 more seconds, all of it profits from one thing: your inability to sit still. And here's the disturbing part: it's working. Study after study in behavioral psychology now confirms what the Stoics argued 2,000 years ago. Through pure reason, the human mind, left without external stimulation, naturally begins to process, reflect, and create meaning. It begins to think. But introduce a constant stream of input, and the mind stops doing that work. It becomes reactive, passive, dependent, not stupid, never stupid, just occupied. There is a difference between a mind that is busy and a mind that is alive, and the entire machinery of modern entertainment and social media is designed to keep your mind busy, because a busy mind consumes. A still mind questions. Questions who's benefiting from their attention. Questions whether the life they're living was actually chosen. Questions what they actually want as opposed to what they've been told to want. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote something in the 1st century that reads today like it was drafted last week. He said, "Retire into yourself as much as you can. See to it that those whose company brings about no improvement in you are avoided." He wasn't being antisocial. He wasn't advocating isolation as an end in itself. He was describing a practice of deliberate self-preservation, because Seneca understood, as a man who had survived exile, political persecution, and the madness of Nero's Rome, that a person who cannot be alone cannot truly be free. The crowd can lead them anywhere. Now, I want you to stay with me here, because this is where most conversations about solitude go wrong. They conflate two things that are entirely different experiences wearing similar masks: loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the ache of an empty room, the waiting for a message that doesn't come, the dinner eaten alone that feels like a verdict rather than a meal. Solitude is the deliberate, conscious choice to inhabit your own presence fully. One is a wound, the other is a practice, and the path from the wound to the practice is one of the most important journeys a human being can make. What the Desert Fathers knew. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, something unusual happened in the deserts of Egypt and Syria. Thousands of men and women, not criminals, not failures, not social outcasts, deliberately walked away from the cities of the Roman Empire and chose to live alone in the wilderness. They were called the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and for the next several hundred years, people walked days and weeks across burning sand to reach them and ask a single question: how do I live? These weren't people who'd given up on life. Many had been wealthy, educated, successful by every standard Rome offered. They left because they'd made a discovery that most people never make, that the person they were in the city, the one performing, competing, accumulating, justifying, was not actually who they were. It was a character they'd been assigned, and they had confused it for themselves. One of the most famous desert fathers, a man named Abba Moses, was asked by a younger monk for a word of wisdom. He said only this: "Go, sit in your cell. Your cell will teach you everything." Your cell, your solitude, your silence. Not a teacher, not a book, not a community. Yourself. Now, I want you to understand something important about what he was describing. He wasn't saying that you have nothing to learn from others. He wasn't romanticizing isolation or pretending that human connection is worthless. He was describing a kind of inner work that cannot be outsourced. You can hire a trainer for your body. You can hire a therapist for your past. You can hire a coach for your career. But no one can do the work of becoming yourself for you. That work happens in silence. And most people never begin it, not because they lack the intelligence or the will, but because it requires a confrontation they're not ready for. Here's what that confrontation actually looks like. You sit alone. You silence the phone. You don't turn on music or a podcast or the television. You don't reach for a book or a task or a project. You just sit. And within minutes, sometimes seconds, it starts. The restlessness, the urge to check something, do something, be somewhere else mentally. And then, if you stay, the thoughts begin to surface. old thoughts, uncomfortable thoughts. The argument you had 3 years ago that still doesn't sit right. The decision you made that you've never fully examined. The feeling you've been calling fine that is clearly not fine. The self you've been presenting to the world versus the self that actually exists. This is where most people run. And I understand why. I genuinely do. Because what surfaces in silence is not always beautiful. It's not always peaceful. Sometimes it's grief you've been carrying for years without a name. Sometimes it's anger you didn't know you'd buried. Sometimes it's a longing so deep and specific that facing it feels dangerous. But here is what the Desert Fathers understood, what the Stoics articulated, what every serious psychological tradition has confirmed. You cannot be free from what you won't face. The suffering that arrives in silence was already there. The silence didn't create it. It only revealed it. And what is revealed can be healed, integrated, transformed. There is a concept in Stoic philosophy that I want to spend real time with because I think it's one of the most important ideas ever articulated, and it has been largely buried under thousands of years of noise. The Stoics called it the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the command center, the part of you that is, at its core, inviolable. Marcus Aurelius, riding alone at night by candlelight in military tents on the northern frontier of Rome. A man managing an empire, wars, plagues, and the weight of being the most powerful person alive, he returned again and again to this one idea, that there exists within every human being a place that cannot be touched by external events. Not circumstances, not other people's opinions, not loss or failure or humiliation. A citadel. Now, Marcus wasn't claiming that nothing hurts. He wasn't advocating for emotional suppression or detachment. His private journals, which became the meditations, are full of grief and doubt and very human struggle. What he was saying was more precise. He was drawing a distinction between what happens to you and what happens within you, between events in the world and your interpretation of them, between the storm and the eye of the storm. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. You have power over your mind." Think about that. How many of your fears are actually yours? How many of your definitions of success, attractiveness, worthiness, intelligence, how many of those were formed in the silence of your own reflection versus the noise of comparison to others? The Stoics were relentless on this point. Epictetus, who had been a literal slave before becoming one of the most influential philosophers of the ancient world, taught this, that the only things truly within our control are our judgments, our desires, our aversions, and our actions. Everything else is, as he called it, not up to us, not other people's opinions, not the outcomes of our efforts, not whether we are liked or understood or appreciated. And the work of discovering what is genuinely up to you, of separating your authentic self from the constructed self that wears social armor all day, that work requires one thing above all: time alone. Real time. Not time alone while scrolling, not time alone while listening to someone else's voice in your ear, not the passive, distracted aloneness of binge-watching a show. Actual silence, actual confrontation with your own interior. This is what the Stoics meant by self-mastery, not the mastery of external performance, the mastery of your own inner world. And you cannot master what you will not visit. I want to tell you about a particular kind of person. They appear throughout history at irregular intervals. They are almost always misunderstood. During their lifetimes, they are often described as strange, difficult, obsessive, unsociable, or arrogant. And they changed the world. Isaac Newton, during the years that produced calculus, the theory of gravity, and foundational work in optics, lived in near total isolation at his family's farm in Woolsthorpe during a plague quarantine. He called it his annus mirabilis, his miraculous year. What everyone else experienced as exile, Newton experienced as the greatest gift of his life. Nikola Tesla, a man whose mind essentially invented the 20th century, was described by contemporaries as pathologically solitary. He dined alone. He walked alone. He spent his most productive years in a hotel room in New York with no company but his work and his mind. When asked once why he didn't cultivate more social relationships, he reportedly said that with the whole universe available to explore, he found the conversation of ordinary social life somewhat insufficient. Emily Dickinson wrote nearly 1,800 poems. She published fewer than a dozen during her lifetime. She spent the final decades of her life rarely leaving her family's house, conducting her entire intellectual and emotional life through letters and the interior world of her mind. What the world saw, a recluse, a woman who had failed at life. What the world inherited, some of the most sophisticated and enduring poetry in the English language. Now, I'm not suggesting that genius requires isolation. That's too simple and clearly false. Great work also emerges from collaboration and community. What I am pointing at is something more precise. Every single person in that list, and the list goes on. Darwin, Kafka, Glenn Gould, Simone Weil, Wittgenstein, Proust, shared something. They all had, at the core of their productive life, a private interior world they had cultivated and defended. A place where other people's opinions did not reach. A place where the noise of comparison and validation and social performance simply did not function. And the work that came out of that place lasted. I want to get honest with you about something uncomfortable. The reason most people avoid solitude isn't laziness. It isn't even fear in the conventional sense. It's addiction. Social validation, the feeling of being seen, approved of, admired, agreed with, activates the same neural pathways as every other compulsive reward system the brain knows. A notification that someone liked your photo releases a small burst of dopamine. It's chemically indistinguishable from the microword of a slot machine paying out. And just like with any addiction, the substance itself isn't the problem. We are social creatures. We genuinely need connection. We need to be seen and understood by others. That's not weakness. It's biology. The addiction is when the external validation replaces the internal one. When you stop being able to feel confident, valuable, or even real without a response from outside. Psychologists call this external locus of control. The Stoics called it living as a slave. When your sense of self depends on factors outside your control, other people's approval, their assessment of your worth, their continued presence in your life, you are, by definition, not free. You are managed by the audience. And here is the cruel part of that arrangement. The audience doesn't know what they want. Their standards shift constantly. Their attention moves. Their affection is, fundamentally, not about you. It's about what you represent to them at any given moment. Build your sense of self on that foundation, and you will spend your life in a state of low-grade panic, constantly trying to maintain something that was never stable to begin with. The Stoic answer to this isn't cold indifference to what others think. It's something more sophisticated. Epictetus again. If anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, "He was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned these alone." That's not bitterness. That's radical internal stability. It comes from a person who has done the work of knowing themselves so thoroughly, through sustained time alone, through honest self-examination, through confronting their own failures without the comfort of external distraction, that someone else's opinion simply cannot land as a fatal blow. Because here is what solitude ultimately produces if you do it honestly. Not certainty, not arrogance, not the hollow performance of not caring. Self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is the only foundation stable enough to build a life on. I want to be concrete here, because most conversations about solitude stay too abstract. They describe the destination without mapping the terrain. So, let me tell you what this actually looks like. Not as a program, not as a set of steps, as an honest account of a practice. The first thing you notice when you begin taking solitude seriously is how uncomfortable silence actually is. Not in the dramatic way of a horror film. It's subtler than that. It's a persistent, low-level restlessness, a compulsion to do something, check something, justify your existence in some small, measurable way. This is normal. This is, in fact, the first layer of work, because that restlessness isn't random. It's revealing something. It's showing you how much of your inner stability has been outsourced to activity and stimulation. When you sit with it, when you don't run, it begins to pass. Not immediately. Sometimes it takes days of practice for the first clean moment of stillness to arrive. But it arrives, and in that stillness, something unusual begins to happen. Thoughts arrive that are qualitatively different from the thoughts you have when you're busy. Slower, less reactive, more genuinely yours. Questions begin to form that you've been too distracted to ask. Not, "What should I do today?" but, "What do I actually want my life to feel like?" Not, "How do I appear to other people?" but, "What kind of person do I actually want to be?" The Stoics had a practice called journaling, or more precisely, philosophical examination. Marcus Aurelius is the most famous example, but the practice was widespread among serious Stoic practitioners. The idea was simple. At the end of each day, you write to yourself. Not for an audience, not for posterity, not to produce something admirable. To examine. What did I do today that aligned with my values? What didn't? Where did I react instead of choosing? Where did I depend on external approval for something I could have generated internally? This isn't self-punishment. The Stoics were explicit about that. The goal isn't to produce guilt, it's to produce clarity. Because a life examined is, over time, a life that becomes more deliberately and authentically yours. There's another Stoic practice called negative visualization, the deliberate contemplation of loss. This sounds morbid at first, but the purpose is profound. By sitting quietly and honestly imagining what your life would look like without the things you currently take for granted, your health, your relationships, your work, your home, you accomplish two things simultaneously. First, you break the deadening effect of habituation. The things you've stopped noticing because they've become invisible, through familiarity, suddenly regain their weight and their color. Second, you discover which losses you could survive. And that discovery, the quiet, honest realization that you are more durable than you imagine, is one of the most liberating experiences available to a human being. The person who knows they can survive alone is not controlled by the fear of abandonment. The person who knows they can rebuild is not paralyzed by the fear of loss. The person who has sat with their own mortality in honest silence is not terrorized by the clock. That is what solitude builds, not hardness, not indifference, durability. I want to address something directly, because I know some of you have been thinking it for the last several minutes. Does all of this lead to isolation? Does building a strong inner life mean stepping back from the people you love? Does learning to be enough for yourself mean eventually needing no one? No. And I think that misunderstanding is responsible for a lot of unnecessary suffering, both in people who fear solitude because they think it means becoming cold, and in people who practice solitude badly and use it as armor against genuine vulnerability. The Stoics were not advocates of emotional isolation. They were not robots. Seneca wrote some of the warmest letters in ancient literature. Marcus Aurelius, in the opening pages of the Meditations, writes at length about the people who shaped him. With gratitude so personal, it's almost uncomfortable to read, like witnessing a private prayer. The point was never to stop caring about people. The point was to stop needing people to be something they cannot be. Specifically, the source of your completeness. Because here is what happens to relationships when two incomplete people try to complete each other. Each person becomes responsible for the emotional stability of the other. Each person's well-being becomes contingent on the behavior of someone they cannot control. The relationship becomes a transaction. I will be okay as long as you behave in ways that make me okay. That is an impossible contract, and every relationship that rests on it is structurally fragile. But a relationship between two people who have each done the work of becoming genuinely comfortable with their own presence, two people who can each be alone without panic, who each have an interior life that doesn't require constant external feeding. That relationship can breathe. It doesn't collapse under the weight of ordinary human imperfection. It doesn't require constant performance. It doesn't need manufactured drama to feel alive. Seneca put it this way: associate with those who will make a better man of you. Not find people who will make you feel better about yourself. Make a better man of you. That's a different kind of love. It requires seeing clearly. And seeing clearly requires first turning that clarity on yourself. The person who has genuinely done the work of solitude doesn't love less. They love better, because they're not asking the person they love to carry what only they can carry for themselves. I want to tell you about a particular experience that happens to people who take this practice seriously, who genuinely commit to the work of deep solitude over a sustained period. It doesn't happen immediately. It usually arrives somewhere in the middle of things, when you've been at this long enough that you've already given up several times and come back. When you've already survived the initial restlessness and begun to find intermittent stretches of genuine stillness, there comes a moment. It can't be forced. It can't be scheduled. It arrives when it arrives, that I can only describe as a kind of falling away. The performance falls away. the constructed identity falls away. All the things you've been trying to prove, all the stories you've been telling about who you are and what happened to you and why you are the way you are, they get quiet. Not erased, not destroyed, just no longer urgent. And in that quiet, something else surfaces, something harder to name, a way of experiencing your own existence that is calmer and somehow more real than the version that was performing all the time. The Zen tradition calls something similar kensho, a brief glimpse of one's original nature. The Christian mystics wrote about it as kenosis, a self-emptying. The Stoics described it in terms of alignment with the logos, the rational order that underlies all things. The language is different, the tradition is different, but they're describing the same territory. What they're all pointing at is this: beneath the personality you've constructed, beneath the wounds you've accumulated, beneath the habits and fears and defenses and desires that define the surface of your daily experience, there is something that is simply aware, not worried, not performing, not trying to be more or less than it is, just aware. Meeting that part of yourself is not a destination. It doesn't resolve all your problems. It doesn't end your struggles. But once you've touched it, even briefly, something shifts, because you now have a reference point, an inner orientation, a place you can return to in the middle of chaos that reminds you of what you actually are beneath all the noise. And with that reference point comes a particular kind of calm that nothing outside you can fully destroy. Not indifference, not numbness, not distance, rootedness. The kind that lets you stand in a storm without being swept away. I want to challenge something that might be sitting quietly in the back of your mind. A small, persistent voice that says, this is self-indulgent. Spending all this time turning inward, building your inner life, protecting your solitude, isn't that ultimately selfish? Doesn't the world need you to be present, available, connected? I understand that voice, and I want to answer it directly. The most exhausted, emotionally depleted, reactive, and ultimately unhelpful version of yourself is the one that never rests, never does the interior work. The version of you that runs on approval and stimulation and constant connection, that confuses busyness with purpose and noise with meaning. That version cannot give what the people around you actually need. Because what the people around you need, your children, your partners, your friends, your colleagues, the strangers who encounter your work, is not more of your performance. They need your presence. Real presence. Not the presence of a person anxiously managing their image. Not the presence of a person so depleted they have nothing left to actually offer. The presence of someone who has come home to themselves, who has done the hard, private work of becoming whole. The Stoics believed in something they called oikeiosis, a natural expansion of care that moves outward from yourself to your family, to your community, to humanity as a whole. But it starts with yourself, not because you matter more than others, but because you cannot genuinely give what you do not have. A person who has not learned to inhabit their own life cannot truly accompany anyone else in theirs. So when you protect your solitude, when you insist on the time and the space to do this inner work, you are not withdrawing from the world. You are preparing to re-enter it as something more useful, more honest, more genuinely capable of love. That is not selfishness. That is the deepest form of responsibility. There's a particular dynamic that happens when you commit seriously to this practice for the first time. The people around you will notice, and some of them won't like it. Not because they wish you harm, not because they are bad people, but because you're changing unsettles something in the arrangement you've had with them. The way you previously played your role in their lives, perhaps by being always available, always responsive, always seeking their approval, always needing their validation. That role is shifting. And the relationships that were built on the old architecture can feel, briefly, like they're dissolving. Some of them will dissolve, and that is a grief worth feeling, honestly. But many of them, the ones with real substance, will eventually settle into something deeper and more honest than what existed before. Because you've stopped performing, and the people who were actually there for you, rather than for the performance, will still be there. And then there are the new connections, the unexpected encounters with people who seem to immediately recognize something in you, who sense the quality of presence you've been building, who are drawn not to your performance or your personality or your accomplishments, but to something quieter than all of that. The Stoics talked about this as the natural consequence of serious philosophical practice. Certain people, regardless of their formal education or their familiarity with Stoic texts, are living in alignment with their own nature. And those people tend to find each other. Not through deliberate seeking, through the simple fact of becoming more fully themselves. When you stop performing for everyone, you become available for someone. The real ones find the real you. And that is a form of connection that the constantly performing, approval-seeking version of you will never experience, because it requires something that performance prevents: being actually known. I want to spend some time here in territory that most videos about solitude and inner strength avoid, because I think that avoidance does real harm. The practice of solitude, honestly pursued, will eventually bring you face to face with real pain. Not the vague discomfort of unfamiliarity, not the restlessness of someone who just needs to put down the phone. Real pain, grief that has never been processed, trauma that has been buried under decades of activity, loneliness so deep and so old that you stopped calling it by its name and started calling it the way things are. And here is what I want to say about that. First, this is not a failure of the practice. It is the practice working exactly as it should. The Stoics were not naive about the existence of suffering. Marcus Aurelius lost children. He lost trusted friends to betrayal. He managed an empire while his body deteriorated. Seneca spent years in exile. Epictetus was a slave who had been physically disabled by his master. They were not writing from positions of comfort and safety. They were writing from the middle of real human suffering. And what they found, not as a theory, but as a lived discovery, was that suffering faced honestly is qualitatively different from suffering avoided. Avoided suffering doesn't go away. It compounds. It shapes your behavior in ways you can't fully see because you've never looked directly at it. Faced suffering, honestly, in solitude, without the distraction of performance or the anesthetic of stimulation, moves. Not quickly, not cleanly, not without cost, but it moves. I want to be clear. There are forms of pain that require more than solitude and philosophy. Serious trauma, clinical depression, grief that has become disabling. These require human support, professional care, community. Solitude is not a substitute for that, but it can be a companion to it, a space in which the work of healing has room to happen. Because ultimately, no therapist can do the integration for you. No community can hold the insights on your behalf. The moments of genuine shift, genuine acceptance, genuine release, those happen inside, in silence, in the space you've built through honest practice. And if you are carrying something heavy right now, if part of what drew you to this video was a particular kind of private ache, I want you to know something. That weight is not permanent, not because you can think it away, not because the right philosophy will dissolve it, but because you are more capable of carrying it and eventually transforming it than you currently believe, and the proof of that capacity is built in solitude. There is a concept that runs through Stoic philosophy like a river through stone, shaping everything around it without announcing itself. The concept is autarkia, often translated as self-sufficiency. But that translation loses something, because autarkia in the Stoic sense isn't about needing no one, or being financially independent, or achieving some state of perfect self-reliance. It's about the experience of inner completeness, the felt sense that, in this moment, as you actually are, you are sufficient. Not perfect, not finished, not without need for growth or change or connection. Sufficient. This might be the most countercultural idea in this entire conversation, because the engine of consumer culture runs precisely on the opposite feeling, on the constant manufacturing of insufficiency. The persistent sensation that you are not enough, that you do not have enough, that you are one purchase, one achievement, one relationship away from the feeling you're chasing. Stoic philosophy does not make you immune to desire. It doesn't make you a person without preferences or ambitions. But practiced seriously, it does something subtle and profound. It breaks the equation between what you have and who you are. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man on earth for nearly 2 decades. He had access to everything Rome could offer: wealth, comfort, pleasure, glory. He used very little of it for personal indulgence, not because he was performing asceticism, but because he had already found what he was looking for in territory that those things couldn't reach. His own mind, his own character, his own honest relationship with what he actually valued. He wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." This is not a dismissal of material reality. It's the testimony of a man who had tested that proposition in circumstances most of us will never face. And what he found, what all of the serious practitioners of solitude find across every tradition and every era, is that the feeling of sufficiency is not delivered by circumstances. It is built quietly in the work of becoming genuinely present to your own existence. Not consumed by it, not performing it, present to it. There's a phenomenon that happens in contemporary life that almost nobody talks about honestly. It's what happens when a person who was previously very visible, socially, professionally, digitally, goes quiet. They stop posting. They stop responding immediately. They stop performing their progress for public consumption. They step back from the social theater, not dramatically, not with an announcement, just quietly. And the world, which was previously very interested in them, moves on almost instantly. This is initially experienced as loss, sometimes as failure, as evidence that you were never as important as you thought. But if you stay quiet long enough to let the initial discomfort pass, something else begins to happen. The silence becomes clarifying. You begin to see, with unusual clarity, which of your relationships existed because you were performing something for the other person. Which of your goals were actually yours versus goals you had adopted from someone else's vision of success. Which of your fears were actually about the thing itself versus the fear of how other people would interpret your failure. You begin to build things differently, slower, with more care, without the constant distraction of managing your image while also trying to do genuine work. And the work, freed from the performance pressure, becomes better. There's a creative principle that serious artists have recognized for centuries. The work that is created for an audience is fundamentally different from the work that is created for the work itself. Not always worse. Sometimes the discipline of audience awareness produces something sharper, more precise. But the deepest work, the work that lasts, the work that contains something true about the human condition, almost always begins in privacy, in the willingness to explore without the safety net of approval, to make something that might be wrong, that might be rejected, that might be misunderstood, because you made it in the service of something truer than applause. This is the Stoic position on creative work, on intellectual work, on the work of living itself. Do it for the virtue of the doing. Do it because it aligns with your best understanding of who you are and what you're here for. Do it in the quiet, without the scaffold of external validation, and let the quality of the work be its own justification. And then see what happens. I want to make a practical suggestion here that sounds simple, but is, in my experience, genuinely powerful. Go somewhere without people. Not permanently. Not for a retreat you've paid $1,000 to attend. Just find a place where you can be genuinely alone with the natural world. A forest early in the morning before anyone else arrives. A stretch of coastline in a season when the tourists have gone. A desert road at dusk. A mountain trail above the tree line where the wind is the only sound, and there is no cell signal, and the sky is enormous and indifferent and utterly. The Stoics spoke often of nature as a teacher, not in the romantic sense, not as a benevolent presence that offers comfort and wisdom, but as a corrective, something that puts human concerns in their actual proportion. Marcus Aurelius wrote about looking at the vast sweep of time and asking, how many emperors have come and gone? How many cities have risen and fallen? How many human struggles that felt absolutely essential in the moment were eventually swallowed by time and silence without a trace? This isn't nihilism. It's scale adjustment. When you stand in a landscape that existed before you arrived and will exist after you're gone, when you feel your smallness not as an insult but as a simple, accurate observation, something loosens in you. The things you've been carrying that were actually not that heavy begin to feel like what they are. The things that are genuinely important, love, integrity, honesty, the quality of your attention, the work that actually matters, they become visible again, unobscured by the noise of things that merely feel urgent. There is a reason that people across every culture in every era have gone to natural solitude, to pray, to think, to grieve, to make decisions that matter. Not because nature is a magic place that provides answers, but because nature is honest in a way that human social environments rarely are. A forest doesn't need you to be impressive. A desert doesn't have an opinion about your career. The ocean doesn't care about your reputation. And in that utter indifference, Something real in you relaxes. The performer steps aside, and the person underneath gets a chance to breathe. I want to bring you somewhere now, not to a conclusion, because this kind of work doesn't conclude. It deepens, but to a vista, a place from which you can see what all of this is actually building toward. The Stoics had a word for what serious philosophical practice produces over time. They called it eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness, but that translation is too shallow. It means something closer to flourishing in the full realization of your nature, not pleasure, not comfort, not the satisfied feeling of having gotten what you wanted. Flourishing, the experience of being fully, honestly, clearly alive. And what every teacher in this tradition converges on? Epictetus freed from slavery, Marcus Aurelius burdened with empire, Seneca navigating political survival, the Desert Fathers in their barren cells, the Zen practitioners in their meditation halls, the solitary scientists and artists and mystics in every culture who chose depth over breadth. What they all converge on is this, that flourishing is not a destination that circumstances can provide. It is a quality of being that is built quietly, consistently, over time, in solitude. And what you build through this practice is genuinely yours. Not the house that can burn, not the status that can be revoked, not the relationship that can end, or the health that can fail, or the wealth that can disappear. Who you are when you have nothing left to perform. The unshakable center, the citadel. Marcus Aurelius, in the last years of his life, still managing wars, still carrying the weight of an empire, still watching the people he loved die, still feeling pain and doubt and grief, wrote this, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. Not in a mountain resort, not in a perfect relationship, not in a state of achieved success or accumulated comfort. His own soul." The interior that he had spent decades cultivating through exactly this practice. And that is the ultimate promise of what we've been exploring. Not that your life will become easier, not that suffering will stop finding you, but that you will become someone for whom the relationship with their own inner life is deep enough, honest enough, and strong enough that nothing outside it has the final word. What you do with the silence. I want to end with something simple. Tonight, at some point before you sleep, I want you to try something. Put the phone down. Not charging across the room, actually somewhere you can't reach it without getting up. Sit somewhere comfortable, not to meditate in any formal sense, not to achieve anything, just to be still. 5 minutes, 10, as long as it takes for the initial restlessness to pass, and then just notice what's actually there, what thoughts arrive when they're not competing with anything louder, what feeling has been waiting patiently underneath all the noise. Don't fix it, don't analyze it, don't immediately translate it into something useful. Just meet it. Because this is where it starts. Not in the grand gesture, not in the formal commitment, or the purchased retreat, or the dramatic announcement. In 5 minutes of honest silence, in the small daily practice of coming back to yourself, in the quiet refusal to let the noise of the world be the only voice you listen to, the Stoics believed that every human being carries within them the capacity for genuine wisdom and genuine freedom, not as a reward for exceptional performance, not as a gift to the fortunate few. as a birthright, already present, already available, waiting only for the silence that makes it audible. You don't have to earn it. You just have to stop running long enough to receive it. The crowd creates noise. The noise fills days, and days become years, and years become a life. The question, the one that has been waiting for you all along, isn't what the world thinks of you. The question is, who are you when the noise stops? Go find out. The quieter you become, the more you are able to hear. Rumi, if something in this landed for you, if there's a part of you that recognized what we've been talking about, sit with it. That recognition is the beginning. And if you want to go deeper, there's more waiting for you here.